Hello, welcome to the latest Science Insights from New Scientist. I'm Rowan Hooper.
And I'm Penny Sarche. On the show this week, we're going to discuss the notorious evil twin of the placebo effect, the nocebo, and the latest on the dark oxygen story. That's this mysterious source of oxygen that's been discovered in the deep sea.
Yeah, that's coming up. Now, since we recorded the show last week, there has been a rather big news item.
Slightly big.
Yeah, President Trump has said he's going to pull the US out of the Paris Climate Agreement. He did that in the first term. That was reversed by President Biden. He's also going to pull out of the World Health Organization. We're going to get into what this means for the US and for the rest of us. But I should note that, first of all, with these executive orders, the US joins Liechtenstein as the only other UN country not in the WHO, and Iran, Libya and Yemen as the only UN countries not signed up to the Paris Accord. So that's some company. And here's the moment when President Trump signs that executive order. And what strikes me is the cheering you hear in the room. And, you know, put that against what we know, that nearly 70% of Americans believe they should stay in the Paris Accord. So here's that moment.
Thank you, sir. The next item here is the withdrawal from the Paris Climate Treaty. We're going to save over $1 trillion by withdrawing from that treaty.
So you'll note there that Trump states without any evidence that pulling out of Paris will save the US $1 trillion. And apparently he's oblivious to the amount of green growth potential there is. It's currently worth over $10 trillion a year. James Deneen is here to discuss this. James, what are the reasons given for leaving Paris?
Yeah, well, the executive order itself says that the agreement, quote, unfairly burdens, unquote, the U.S. and isn't in the interest of putting America first. As you say, this is the second time Trump has pulled the U.S. out of the Paris Agreement. This time around, though, it will take just a year for the withdrawal to become official.
I guess the big question is, how much of an impact do we think this will have?
Yeah, that is the big question. It's likely to throw a big wrench in the gears of global climate action at a time when momentum to slash emissions was already waning in a lot of ways. Last year, as we discussed last week, saw record global emissions, and we saw global average temperatures rise by 1.5 degrees Celsius for the first time. The U.S. is the world's largest economy and second largest current emitter and largest historical emitter, and its exit will leave it without leverage to push for deeper emission cuts from other countries, and it could create an excuse for other countries to decrease their own climate commitments.
And there's also this factor, isn't there, that the US has been a key source of funding for climate finance. And so, you know, we need that money to help low-income countries cut their emissions and adapt to climate change.
Yeah, losing that money definitely could be another blow. However, the U.S. withdrawal doesn't mean the end of global climate action. One person I spoke to said it doesn't mean the bottom drops out. Countries representing more than 90% of global emissions are still part of the Paris Agreement, and wind and solar energy, electric vehicles, batteries, and other clean energy technologies also now play a much larger role in the global economy than the first time the U.S. withdrew. So environmental advocates I spoke with said maybe the real effect of the decision will be to give the U.S. less of a role in shaping ongoing climate negotiations and really cede influence to China, its rival, which already dominates many of the clean energy technologies taking off. Here's David Waskow from the World Resources Institute.
Well, I think it's the U.S. will be ceding influence over how those markets are shaped, but also will be ceding the markets, period, in the sense that I don't think other countries will look first to the U.S. when thinking about who it's going to talk with or commercially engage with, or whether it's solar or wind or electric vehicles or battery manufacturing. The U.S. won't be the first port of entry, if you will, for those conversations. I think China's already begun to take a substantial leadership position on that front, and this would only underscore and reinforce that dynamic. I do think a few things are worth keeping in mind. 90% of global emissions will still be represented by those countries that are part of the Paris Agreement. And so that process still has quite a lot of bite, I would say. There are ways in which what the U.S. does or doesn't do in concrete terms will have an effect. It's still the second largest emitter globally right now in current terms, largest historical emitter, largest economy. So the U.S. will nonetheless still have an impact. I think, clearly the Trump administration is aiming to throw obstacles in the way of climate action at home, but that doesn't mean that the bottom is going to fall out. And I think that's an important thing for other countries, particularly to recognize that there are dynamics underway in the U.S. that will continue to move things in the direction of climate action.
Now, James, Trump has also halted federal permits for wind energy, and he's rolled back policies that Biden put in place that would encourage the uptake of electric vehicles, which is weird when he's got Elon Musk as his right-hand man. And it seems to put America second, not first. I saw someone saying that the US could start to look like Russia and Cuba did back in the days when you had these old cars. We might get that sort of situation in the US.
Yeah, it definitely puts the U.S. on a different track from much of the rest of the world. It's worth saying, too, that other executive orders are aimed at expanding fossil fuel development on federal lands in coastal waters and in Alaska, as well as increasing exports of natural gas, all to solve what yet another executive order declares is a national energy emergency.
And then another big one was this withdrawing the US from the World Health Organization. And Michael LePage is here. Michael, can you take it back to basics for us? Why do we need the World Health Organization? And why should rich countries like the US, the UK, pay for it? What does it do for us?
Well, have you ever had smallpox?
No,
Have you ever had polio? So these are some of the successful vaccination campaigns that the WHO has helped coordinate. Now, of course, the WHO didn't develop those vaccines, but what it did do is help get those vaccines rolled out around the world. And that's why we were able to eliminate smallpox. So if only some countries had vaccinated, it wouldn't have been as successful as it was. So that's what the WHO does. It helps countries work together to tackle diseases. And when countries work together, obviously, that's much more effective than if they all do their own thing. And of course, with infectious diseases, that's so important, because if just one country fails to control an infectious disease, then it becomes everyone's problem very fast.
So I think COVID-19 sort of proved that for everyone, right?
Absolutely. But it's not just about potential pandemics. So there are lots of diseases that could become or already are a big problem. So obviously there's tuberculosis and HIV/AIDS. But Mpox is also a good example. So we've seen this big resurgence of Mpox in Africa in recent years. And also it's spread beyond the shores of Africa for the first time. So why is this happening? Well, it turns out that the smallpox vaccine also protected against Mpox. Now we've stopped smallpox vaccination because we've eradicated it. Now Mpox can sort of come back strongly. Now we've still got vaccines that can stop people getting Mpox. So if we rolled those vaccines out in Africa, they'll protect the people there, and they'll also stop the disease spreading around the world. And that's what the WHO is trying to get countries to help it to do. And obviously, it'll be a lot cheaper than dealing with problems after they occur. Trying to, if Mpox does spread around the world again, we see more outbreaks around the world. That's a lot harder to deal with than stopping it at its source.
Yeah, about the budgets for it, for the WHO. When I was researching this for my book, How to Spend $1 Trillion, I was shocked actually by how small the WHO's budget is.
Yeah, I was surprised by that. I didn't actually know it before doing this story.
You mean you didn't read my book? Chapter 1.
I have to.
No, Chapter 2.
So the total budget of the WHO is around $7 billion. Around a fifth of that comes from the US government. Now, the first thing to say about the money that comes from the US, that's almost entirely voluntary. It's not required for membership. And now the other thing to say, as you're saying, it's a really tiny sum, especially if you put it in relative terms. So the UK, for instance, spends more than $200 billion a year on health. The US spends $5 trillion a year. And it's estimated that the COVID pandemic cost the US around $16 trillion. So these are huge sums. The WHO budget is tiny in comparison. There's another way of looking at it. So the WHO budget, the entire budget, comes to less than $1 for every single person in the world. And compare that to, say, the US, which spends around $13,000 for every single individual.
Yeah, I asked Krutika Kupali about this. She's an infectious disease physician, lives in Dallas. She's got experience in global health, pandemic preparedness, and she worked at the WHO. And I asked her what happens if the US loses access to all these networks that the WHO provides, and here she is.
This is particularly concerning as we have a recently declared Marburg outbreak in Tanzania, an ongoing public health emergency of international concern related to Mpox, and a worsening H5N1 outbreak here in the United States. If the withdrawal does occur, WHO will likely turn to other countries, private donors, or partnerships to fill their funding gap. At the end of the day, global health is all about teamwork. If WHO struggles, it could weaken efforts to fight diseases around the world, and that could ripple back to affect everyone, including those of us living here in the United States.
Yeah, it shocked me, as I say, how much little money the WHO has and how much more it could do if it had more. I mean, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, they alone give almost as much to the WHO as the US do, or did.
Yes, I mean, the WHO could certainly do a lot with more resources. That said, the reason the budget is so small is that it's coordinating things. It's not actually providing healthcare directly. It works with the existing healthcare agencies in each country, and of course it only does so with their consent. Now, the US withdrawal from the WHO seems to be based on this misconception that the WHO is in charge of what countries do and it somehow mishandled the COVID pandemic. Now, yes, of course, the WHO makes recommendations, but countries don't actually have to follow it. They're not under any obligation to do what it says. And, of course, during the pandemic, a lot of countries, including the US, just went and did their own things and completely ignored the WHO advice. Now, you can ask, there's lots of room for debate about whether that advice was correct or not, but at the end of the day, the blame for what happened lies with the governments who were in charge at the time. And, of course, we all know who was in charge in the US at the time.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks, Michael, and thanks, James. And of course, we'll be reporting on all the science consequences of the new administration going forward. Okay, so you know about the placebo effect.
I do. That's the idea that if you take a pill or sort of like a sugar pill that's got no medical properties and you're told it's going to make you better, it will make you better.
Yeah, and we use it all the time. For example, if a child has a scratch on their finger and you kiss it better, maybe that might work.
Yeah, I mean, it is really cool stuff, isn't it? About the power of the brain, what the brain can do, being told that you can heal yourself by feeling better about it.
Yeah, that's one of my favourite bits. If you say, this is just a placebo, but it's still really effective.
Yeah.
That still actually works for people.
Yeah.
But what about the nocebo effect then?
The nocebo effect. No, go on, remind me.
So it's often called the evil twin of the placebo effect. And it's the same thing. If you're given a dummy pill, but you're told that it might make you feel bad, in a certain degree of people, you will get them reporting all kinds of
suggestive
symptoms just because they've been told that it might happen. Yeah. So we've got Alexandra Thompson here. You've been working on a story this week about the nocebo effect, and you sort of wrinkle in our understanding about it. And this does have important real-world implications, doesn't it?
Yes, so as you say, if people think they're getting an inferior medicine, they report more ill effects. And this could manifest in the way it's packaged, its name, its price. So to very briefly explain, when pharmaceutical firms have a new drug, they patent the discovery, give it a catchy name, and if it gets official approval for use, they put it on the market. But once that patent expires, other firms can make their own generic versions, which are pharmacologically identical but sold more cheaply.
Yeah, so ibuprofen is a good example, isn't it? So it's Advil. It's called Advil in the US. The brand name, one brand name in the UK is Nurofen. Or you can just buy unbranded as ibuprofen. It's much cheaper. But the branded ones, they do look better. They've got nice packaging and it looks like it's going to help you better. It's got fancy graphics on it that make they're going to do my pain relief a lot more.
Advertising campaigns as well, yeah.
But do you want to pay for a fancy package?
No, I don't. I buy the cheap stuff and it works.
Yeah, me too. Yeah. So what a new study has looked at now is whether a generic medicine has more negative effects than the branded drug that is pharmacologically identical. So to pick this apart, researchers researchers in Australia recruited people for a study to purportedly examine the influence of 2 oxytocin nasal spray medications on feelings of cooperation and trust. Half the participants got information that made the treatment look like a branded drug, and half were told information that made it seem generic. So for about half of each group, that information related to its price. So it was either $2 Australian or 30 Australian dollars. And for the rest of them, it related to its name. So if it's short and catchy, it's probably branded. If it's long and scientific sounding, it's probably generic.
But they all had the same treatment, an oxytocin treatment.
Well, no treatment at all.
Right,
so
okay.
all of them were given a sham treatment that was actually a saline spray.
Great.
And they were told these sprays could cause side effects, so headaches, nausea, rashes. And then a further group of 62 people received nothing, no sprays. So at the end of the study, those taking part rated their expectations of the spray and how bad any side effects had been, just using a standard scale. And what they found was those on the more expensive or branded sham spray reported slightly more symptoms than the no spray control group. But those on the cheaper or generic sounding one reported twice as many as the control group, and they had lower expectations for it.
Right. So when we know that, like, how does that affect how we treat people in hospital, for example?
Well, I think cost is a consideration when you're treating someone. It sounds quite crass to talk about expenses when somebody's ill, but we know that cost is one of many considerations. So going for a generic treatment shouldn't be a bad thing. But then if people sort of turn their nose up at cheaper drugs because really they should work as well as their more expensive equivalents. So now that we know more about how this happens, maybe it could encourage doctors or pharmacists to word things in a way that help to elicit that sort of healing response so people get the most out of a medication.
It'd be tempting to lie to them and saying, this is really expensive, top brand medicine you're getting.
Yeah, don't tell the pharmaceutical companies about this, whatever you do.
Yeah.
I don't know if lying is the right way forward.
Maybe a bit unethical. Yeah, okay.
But we do sort of think, expensive equals effective equals better quality. But the active ingredient is the same. I think it's worth saying that if you're allergic to one of the non-active ingredients in the generic, that's when you go for the branded. So if the generic is a pink pill and the branded is a blue pill and whatever makes it pink you're allergic to, then you go for the branded one. But otherwise, the active ingredient is the same.
So it's a shame. I mean, did they test at all whether you could say this one is more expensive, but actually they have the same active ingredients, and see if that then brought down this effect? Did they go that one step further?
No, but that would be interesting. They sort of left people to decipher for themselves, like, this is the price, this is the name, make your own mind up.
And I wanted to ask you about, we covered a study back in 2017, I think, about, it was a very similar kind of experiment, but it was 2 types of cream. One looked more expensive than the other, and participants were told it might increase their sensitivity to pain. But this time they found that the more expensive cream was associated with this higher nocebo effect. What do you think is going on there? It's the other way round.
I know, I came across that when I commissioned this. I think it might depend on what they're looking for in the study. So for this one, they're looking sort of for side effects. So you think, I've been given a dud here and it's making me feel more ill. Whereas for that one, maybe they were told, like, I'm irritated, I'm having to pay more. So I'm going to find a reason why I'm resenting this more expensive one.
Just goes to show how much nuance there is when you're thinking about placebo and nocebo effects.
So, if you tell people that it's a placebo effect, it doesn't matter, can you sort of nudge them with the nocebo effect as well?
Yes, I think that the key is to explain to people. That's what the external source we spoke to, the researcher, you just explain what this is to people. Don't be patronising, be empathetic, and it should help people feel reassured that they're not getting an inferior treatment.
Now, last year we reported on quite a startling story about metallic deep sea nodules, those ones we have heard a lot about them being potentially a source of oxygen. And we've got an update on this story now from reporter Madeleine Cuff. Maddie, first, remind us what that story was in the first place.
Yes, it was quite a big deal when the story broke in August last year. So, in short, some researchers were measuring the oxygen flux on the sea floor in parts of the Pacific Ocean. And what they expected to find was when they sealed off a part of the ocean that the oxygen levels would decrease. But instead of that happening, the data that they got suggested that oxygen levels were in fact increasing. And the idea that these researchers proposed was that these metallic nodules, which litter the seabed in parts of the Pacific Ocean, were the source of this oxygen. They thought that the nodules were kind of acting as natural batteries, generating an electric current that was splitting seawater into hydrogen and oxygen.
Yeah, I mean, and that's amazing in and of itself. But the other thing that made it a really big deal is people want to mine these nodules, and they say, or they propose that it's a less environmentally damaging way than conventional mining on Earth, you know.
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, obviously, if you remove these nodules from the seafloor and they are, in fact, producing oxygen, that could have really serious ramifications for the deep sea ecosystem.
And it's sort of hard to overstate what a shock this finding was, right? People were absolutely flabbergasted when it first came out.
Yeah, but because, I mean, previously, everyone thought that oxygen production relied on the presence of plants to perform photosynthesis. And this new discovery really could upend that accepted wisdom and reshape our understanding of how these deep ocean ecosystems work, which we don't actually know a huge amount about. So it probably wasn't surprising that the findings were really highly controversial and they made headlines around the world. And the researchers involved, they themselves said that they initially ignored their findings because they just didn't believe it. And it took them years to be convinced that, you know, that the data that they were finding was true. And there are still a lot of unanswered questions about how this process is taking place. But the team still insists that their basic findings, that somehow oxygen is being produced by these nodules in the deep ocean, remains correct. The lead researcher, who's a guy called Andrew Sweetman at the Scottish Association for Marine Science, he's kind of turned into something of a celebrity since this paper was published. He said I spoke to him last week and he said he's even had people stopping him in the street to ask for a photo, which I don't think is a common experience for most academics. And they've now announced a 3-year research project to try and prove that this dark oxygen production is taking place and start to explain exactly why it's happening.
Well, so there's been some criticism as well, though, and he's had quite a lot of him rain down on him, as well as the nice parts of being recognised and stuff, hasn't he? And some doubts really about what's really happening about this process.
Yeah, there's been some pretty intense criticism, both from some scientists as well as the deep sea mining companies interested in harvesting these nodules. And to some extent, you would expect some back and forth over findings, right? It's a normal part of the scientific process. And particularly when a discovery is this surprising, skepticism about it is quite healthy. But it is fair to say that this debate around the dark oxygen has been more charged than normal. And in fact, when I spoke to Sweetman, he described what he's been through as online bullying. There has been some specific criticisms of some of the methodologies that Sweetman and his team used by deep sea mining companies, the scientists in those firms, and also independent researchers. Sweetman himself insists that all of these criticisms can be rebutted and that his findings stand. But I mean, really, this is a question of getting more evidence, right? Until we have more data and more information on whether this process is actually happening, these questions are going to swirl around this discovery. So I think that's in part the aim of this new research program, is to really prove the doubters wrong and add some more evidence to the pile to show whether or not this dark oxygen production is happening.
And that's the plan, is it? Go out and repeat it?
Yeah, exactly. That's the first part of the mission. And it's quite a big difference to what happened last time, because Sweetman and his team kind of stumbled across this process by accident. This time, they're going out specifically to look for it. So they've got some custom-built landers that can descend much deeper into the ocean than their previous equipment. And that means they can survey lots more of the seabed. And they're going to have slightly different approach to measuring this. So they're going to start looking at whether hydrogen is also being produced as well as oxygen, for example. And they'll label some of the isotopes in the water so that they can trace how the chemicals have changed. So hopefully they should really start to pin down whether this process is happening.
And I guess there's quite some urgency to figuring out what's going on.
Yeah, I mean, in a way, it's kind of a race against time because there are deep sea mining companies who want to start scooping up these nodules because I mean, it's important to say that there could be an environmental argument to doing deep sea mining because these nodules are packed with materials that we need to create clean energy technologies. So they're looking to start this as soon as possible. But in the meantime, we need to really find out if this scientific proposal is correct, and find out how that's happening. So Sweetman wants the deep sea mining companies to hold off starting any activities until they've completed their research. So there's some butting heads over timelines here.
Rowan, you've been getting your hands dirty.
I have. I've been to a new exhibition at Somerset House here in London, all about the wonder of soil. Dirt. No, not dirt. Soil. That's what it's not. It's not dirt. It's soil. It's living stuff. It's called Soil, the World at Our Feet, and it's about the vital role soil has, both in our lives and in our planet's future. And there's loads at the exhibition, and even if you don't get to go to it, it's going to tour actually as well. But even if you don't go to it, there's loads to engage with remotely, and I'll put a link in the show notes. But here's a clip from the co-curators of the show, Henrietta Coulthard and Bridget Elworthy, and I asked them about the aim behind the exhibition. And in the background, you can hear is the sounds of the soil microbiome that's part of an installation by this Dutch photographer called Wim van Egmond, who's done this amazing time-lapse of soil life. So first we're going to hear Bridget and then Henrietta.
Somehow we needed to get to those people who thought that the dirt on their hands was actually something you need to wash away and not something to treasure and nurture.
Yes, and I think our whole view of soil needs to change, really. As Bridgie says, people think it's like dirt and inert, but actually it's alive, and that's what we really wanted to show, that it is this incredible ecosystem beneath our feet. And so while we're getting on with our daily lives, this whole world beneath our feet is busy recycling organic matter and really sustaining all life above ground.
That's all for this week. Thanks to all our guests and thanks to you for listening. Do tell your friends about us and give us a 5-star rating and review on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, wherever you listen.
And we'll be back next week. Bye for now.
Bye.